6 terrifying consequences of messing with a chosen child of God. Have you ever paused in the middle of a heated moment, right when your emotions are loud and your thoughts are racing, and wondered whether the person in front of you might carry more spiritual weight than you realize? Not weight in status, not wealth, not popularity, but a quiet calling that only God truly sees. Many of us move through life assuming we understand people at first glance, measuring them by their confidence, their mistakes, or the way they present themselves. Yet Scripture reminds us again and again that God often chooses the overlooked, the underestimated, the ones who do not look impressive on the outside but carry a deep purpose on the inside. When we forget this, our words become sharper, our judgments become quicker, and our hearts slowly lose the sensitivity that faith is meant to build within us. The truth is, being chosen by God does not always look glamorous. It often looks like perseverance through hardship, quiet obedience when no one is applauding, and integrity when compromise would be easier. Because of this, it is easy to misunderstand who God is working through. We might dismiss someone as weak, naive, or insignificant, not realizing that heaven may be shaping them for something meaningful. And when pride blinds us, we can step into conflicts, criticisms, or dismissive attitudes that do not only affect them, but begin to shape our own spiritual condition in ways we do not immediately notice. The consequences are rarely loud at first. They are subtle, internal, and gradual, like a dimming light rather than a sudden blackout. This message is not about fear or superstition. It is about awareness, humility, and wisdom. It is about recognizing that every believer carries dignity, that every soul has value, and that how we treat others reflects what is truly happening inside our hearts. When we approach people with respect and discernment, we protect not only relationships but our own spiritual clarity. But when we allow pride, jealousy, or careless judgment to guide our actions, we may unknowingly step into patterns that distance us from peace, empathy, and purpose. Today, we're not looking to accuse or condemn anyone. We're opening our eyes together, examining our attitudes honestly, and choosing a path that aligns more closely with grace, understanding, and the character that faith is meant to cultivate within us. Consequence number 1: spiritual blindness through pride. One of the most dangerous consequences of mistreating someone God is shaping is not something dramatic that happens overnight. It is something quiet that grows inside the heart. Pride has a way of convincing us that we are simply being honest, strong, or decisive, when in reality we're becoming less willing to listen, less willing to reflect, and less willing to admit that we might be wrong. When a person repeatedly dismisses, mocks, or looks down on someone who walks closely with God, the first thing that often fades is spiritual sensitivity. It becomes harder to feel conviction, harder to recognize gentle warnings, and easier to justify harsh behavior. The Bible frequently links pride with blindness, not physical blindness, but an inability to see truth clearly. This blindness does not mean a person suddenly stops believing. It is more subtle than that. It appears in small decisions, in tone of voice, in the way criticism is delivered without compassion. A person may still pray, still attend church, still read scripture. Yet the humility that allows those practices to change the heart begins to shrink. Pride quietly replaces curiosity with certainty. Instead of asking, "Could I be wrong?" the mind says, "I'm definitely right." Over time, this attitude builds a wall that blocks growth. God often works through correction, through conversations, and through unexpected messengers. When pride dominates, those messengers are ignored or ridiculed, and valuable lessons are lost. Consider how often Scripture shows leaders who started well but stumbled when arrogance entered their hearts. Their downfall rarely began with a major sin. It began with small dismissals, with impatience toward others, with a refusal to acknowledge limits. Pride convinces a person that their perspective is the only accurate one, and once that belief takes root, empathy fades. The chosen child of God in front of them may simply be someone trying to remain faithful, yet pride interprets faithfulness as weakness or annoyance. The tragedy is not only the harm done to the relationship, the deeper loss is the dulling of spiritual awareness, the slow fading of the inner voice that once guided decisions wisely. The solution is not fear, but humility. Humility does not mean thinking less of yourself. It means leaving room for reflection. It means asking questions before forming conclusions. When humility returns, spiritual sight becomes clearer again. A humble heart can apologize, can learn, and can grow. Pride blinds, but humility restores vision. Consequence number 2, misdirected judgment and relational fracture. Another consequence that emerges when we mistreat those God is working through is the breaking of relationships through misdirected judgment. Judgment itself is not always wrong. Discernment is necessary in life. The problem begins when judgment is driven more by emotion than truth, more by ego than wisdom. Many conflicts that seem spiritual on the surface are actually rooted in misunderstanding, insecurity, or wounded pride. When a person assumes the worst about someone without seeking clarity, relationships begin to fracture. Words are spoken too quickly, labels are assigned too easily, reputations are damaged without full understanding. Jesus consistently warned about the danger of judging without self-examination. The issue was never accountability. The issue was hypocrisy and harshness. When someone attacks or belittles a believer who is sincerely trying to follow God, the damage often spreads beyond two individuals. Communities divide. Trust weakens. People begin to take sides rather than seeking peace. What could have been resolved through conversation becomes a lingering wound because judgment replaced compassion. The chosen child of God is not always perfect, but treating them with contempt rather than grace often reveals more about the judge than the one being judged. Relational fracture is painful because humans are created for connection. When judgment becomes habitual, isolation follows. Friends become cautious, conversations become guarded. Even when the original conflict fades, the atmosphere of distrust remains. The irony is that many who judge harshly believe they are defending truth, yet truth delivered without love loses its power to heal. Scripture repeatedly pairs truth with grace for a reason. One without the other becomes either cruelty or compromise. A practical example can be seen in everyday life. Imagine a church volunteer who makes a public mistake and is immediately criticized online by fellow believers. Instead of private correction and support, the criticism spreads quickly. The volunteer withdraws, confidence is damaged, and the community loses a willing servant. Months later, reconciliation requires far more effort than a simple conversation would have required at the beginning. Judgment that was meant to correct ends up discouraging and dividing. The path forward is not silence or avoidance. It is intentional compassion. When judgment is guided by patience and understanding, relationships strengthen rather than break. Compassion does not weaken truth. It gives truth a bridge to reach the heart. Consequence number 3, hardened heart and loss of empathy. When a person repeatedly allows pride and harsh judgment to guide their behavior towards someone God is shaping, another consequence slowly forms beneath the surface, the hardening of the heart. This does not usually happen in a single moment. It is the result of many small decisions to ignore compassion, to overlook another person's struggles, or to treat sensitivity as weakness. At first, the change is almost invisible. Reactions become slightly colder, patience becomes slightly shorter, and forgiveness becomes slightly more difficult. Over time, what once stirred empathy begins to feel distant, and what once felt wrong starts to feel normal. The heart, designed to respond with care and understanding, gradually becomes less responsive. A hardened heart is not always aggressive. Sometimes it is simply indifferent. Indifference can be just as damaging as hostility, because it erodes the very qualities that allow faith to grow. Scripture often emphasizes mercy, because mercy keeps the heart flexible, open, and alive. When empathy fades, spiritual maturity stalls. A person may still perform religious routines, yet their ability to truly connect with others weakens. They may hear about someone's pain and feel nothing, or witness injustice and remain unmoved. The chosen child of God they once dismissed becomes a reminder of their own growing distance from compassion. This hardening also affects self-perception. When empathy diminishes, self-reflection diminishes with it. The person becomes less likely to examine motives or admit mistakes. Instead of asking, "How did my actions affect others?" the focus shifts entirely inward. Emotional numbness can even be mistaken for strength or stability, when in reality it is a protective layer that blocks growth. Faith is meant to soften the heart, not shield it from feeling. When harsh treatment of others becomes habitual, the spiritual cost is a gradual loss of emotional depth and relational warmth. Restoring empathy requires intentional effort. It begins with slowing down, listening without interrupting, and allowing oneself to feel concern rather than rushing to judgment. Compassion is not weakness, it is clarity. A soft heart is more receptive to guidance, more willing to learn, and more capable of genuine connection. When empathy returns, relationships heal more easily, and spiritual insight becomes sharper. The heart that remains open is the heart that continues to grow. Consequence number 4, distorted perception of God's character. Another subtle but powerful consequence of mistreating those God is working through is the distortion of how a person views God himself. When someone consistently dismisses or belittles sincere believers, they often begin to reshape their understanding of God around their own attitudes. Instead of seeing God as just, patient, and compassionate, they may start to imagine him as selective, biased, or aligned only with personalities they personally admire. This distorted perception does not appear all at once. It forms gradually, influenced by pride, favoritism, and limited perspective. One common misunderstanding is the belief that God only defends influential or visible figures. Modern culture often equates popularity with authority, and that mindset can quietly slip into spiritual thinking. Yet Scripture repeatedly shows that God values humility more than recognition. Many of the individuals God used most powerfully were overlooked, underestimated, or even rejected by their communities. When someone assumes that divine favor is tied to status or charisma, they begin to measure spiritual worth through external appearance rather than inner character. This not only misjudges people, it misrepresents God's nature. A distorted view of God also affects trust. If a person believes God is partial or inconsistent, their faith becomes unstable. They may feel justified in treating certain believers with disrespect because they assume those individuals lack importance. Over time, this assumption weakens reverence and reduces accountability. The irony is that the more someone underestimates others, the more their own understanding of God shrinks. Instead of seeing a God who values every sincere heart, they begin to see a God who mirrors their own preferences. Correcting this distortion requires returning to foundational truths about God's character. Scripture emphasizes fairness, mercy, and impartial love. Recognizing this restores balance and humility. When a person understands that God's attention is not limited to the visible or the powerful, their interactions with others change. Respect grows, assumptions decrease, and compassion becomes more natural. A clear perception of God leads to clearer treatment of people. When the image of God is accurate, relationships become healthier and spiritual confidence becomes steadier. Consequence number 5 and number 6, inner turmoil and missed purpose. The final consequence is often the most overlooked because it happens internally before it becomes visible externally. When someone consistently mistreats or dismisses those God is shaping, they may begin to experience a quiet but persistent inner unrest. It is not always dramatic anxiety or obvious guilt. Sometimes it appears as restlessness, dissatisfaction, or a lingering sense that something is not aligned. A person might achieve goals, maintain routines, and appear successful on the outside, yet inside there is a subtle tension that refuses to disappear. This tension grows from unresolved attitudes, unexamined pride, and broken connections that were never repaired. Inner turmoil is powerful because it affects clarity. Decisions become more confusing, motivation becomes inconsistent, and joy feels temporary rather than steady. The heart senses that something is out of harmony, even if the mind cannot immediately identify the cause. Scripture often connects peace with reconciliation and humility for this very reason. When relationships are strained through harsh treatment or careless judgment, the spiritual atmosphere within a person becomes unsettled. It is difficult to pursue a meaningful calling while carrying unresolved bitterness or hidden resentment. Purpose thrives in an environment of integrity and humility, not intention and denial. Missing purpose rarely happens through one large mistake. It usually unfolds through many small misalignments. A person may delay opportunities because they are preoccupied with conflict. They may hesitate to step forward because unresolved guilt weakens confidence. In some cases, they may even avoid environments where growth could happen simply because pride resists accountability. The tragedy is not that purpose disappears, but that it becomes harder to recognize and pursue. The chosen child of God they once dismissed might have been part of a lesson, a collaboration, or a moment of growth that was overlooked due to ego or impatience. Yet this consequence also carries hope, because inner unrest can become a signal rather than a sentence. It can be the gentle reminder that reconciliation is still possible, and humility is still available. When a person chooses to reflect honestly, apologize where necessary, and restore damaged relationships, clarity begins to return. Peace follows integrity. Purpose becomes easier to see when the heart is no longer divided between pride and conviction. Faith was never meant to trap a person in guilt or fear. It was meant to guide them toward alignment, wisdom, and meaningful direction. When humility replaces defensiveness and reconciliation replaces avoidance, the inner turmoil fades and the path forward becomes brighter, steadier, and far more fulfilling.